You know when you wake up in the middle of the night, sure there's someone else in the room, and sometimes you're sure you've seen something out of the corner of your eye, something that isn't there when you look. That's the sideways dimension. A place where things almost are but don't quite exist. Things that don't have a place in the real world. Anna sighed a little, and that's where this Kilbey came from, this sideways dominion. Theo paused. No, she said. It's where we are. Salmon Dusk, a series of podcasted stories written and read by Myke Bartlett. Story 1, Sideways, Episode 2. As quickly as it had filled, the pub emptied again, the air silent, carrying nothing more than tiptoeing armies of dust. Theo wondered if she had blinked, or if she had stared too hard. "We're still there," Kilbey told her, getting to his feet. "The real world. But we can't get back to it yet." He led Theo towards the back of the pub, where a door opened onto a set of stairs with appalling posture. A roughly printed notice pinned to the bricks beside it read Salmon Dusk, first floor. "That's you," Theo realized. "You live here. Here." A shrug. "The Major, the landlord, gives us a good rate." The first floor had once been a function hall and was now a vast, high-ceilinged space with little to occupy it but darkness, dust, and a chill that quickly entered the bones. 2 glass chandeliers hung from the cracked, watermarked plaster, but the room was dressed in poor, cobwebbed finery, motes glittering in the glow of a dozen candles collapsed into the ruins of countless more. Sunlight nudged unsuccessfully at heavy drapes drawn across each of the large windows. A scorched kettle sat atop a small gas stove on a bar, accompanied by 3 ill-matched mugs, the wall behind it an improvised, dusty collage of broken glass and spirits. Aside from this, the room appeared occupied only by a small wooden table, 3 folding chairs, a tatty rug, and a tattier couch. "Well, this is all here," Kilbey said, presumably to himself. "But I'm not." He raised his chin and shouted, "Nero!" then listened to his voice echo until giving up any hope of any reply. Checking his watch, he indicated the chairs gathered about the table. "He'll be here," he said, lifting the bottle he had brought with him from below. "But we've got time for a chat." Kilbey explained everything as the wine turned their teeth blue and their lips black. "History's over," he said. "It ended 8 weeks ago and nobody noticed. The credits have run and the theatre is empty, except for stray popcorn and the lingering pong of teenage boys. Nobody's watching, but we're still here. Stuck on the screen with nothing to do. Just characters waiting for a new story." "But how can history be over? I mean, it's just, a catalogue of stuff, isn't it? Stuff that happened." "Well, it's not a catalogue. It's a rule book. Everything that was meant to happen was written down, but now everything's happened. End of story. The book's gone. There are no rules." The sideways dimension was always about, he said, but usually trapped behind thick glass. Now the world was too old, and the glass had become brittle. Cracks were appearing, and occasionally, things that shouldn't have existed would reach through, grasping for existence. Somewhere in this city there's a hole in history, in reality itself, and it's getting bigger. I'm the only detective in town who keeps an eye on what crawls through. Things that aren't real. Things like whatever sneaked up on you and claimed you for its own. "One of those floater things, you mean?" "No, pay attention, Cartwright. The floaters are just dark spots on the glass between the worlds. They can pop either side for a quick nibble. No, something came crashing through for you." "Why me?" "Well, it beats me. Because you exist. You're a solid piece of reality they can anchor themselves to, building their own world around you. If you find a way out, their world stops. Without you, they're nothing. He might have been talking about her mother, Theo thought, but for once she held back the sharper edge of her tongue and listened. Something had grabbed her, Kilbey said, pulling her out of reality into somewhere that only looked like it. He had spent weeks trying to find where she had gone, looking for the fracture. The longer he looked, the more the fracture spread, scavengers appearing in places Theo had been. Last Wednesday, in their local, as Kilbey had dusted a pool cue, 3 had appeared by the dartboard, one instantly devouring the silent, middle-aged man who sat every night watching the television with immeasurable sadness. The other 2 went for the landlord, Kilbey told her, but I got a mate who's dead handy with the pool cue. The longer Theo wasn't where she was supposed to be, the more scavengers would find their way through the tear. Finally, Kilbey glimpsed her out of the corner of his eye, felt his way into the tear, and waited there. I needed a final tug, he explained, a helping hand from someone on this side of the glass. Every time he looked at me directly, he shoved me back. So what happens now you're here? Kilbey checked his watch. Well, we could pop upstairs for 10 minutes. It's been a couple of weeks since I've seen you. I don't think so. For all I know, you're making this up. But you do still fancy me. I couldn't possibly comment. You do? I knew it. Anyway, he brushed this flirtation aside. What happens now is I find where you fell through, take you back, and close the gap before anyone else gets hurt. Call it community service. A finger pressed to his lips and his shoulders tightened. Don't move, he said, and then, Nero? Who's Nero? He's the reason we're here. A finger ran a circle about the dusty room, even if Kilbey's eyes stayed front. Nero Dusk, my partner. There you are. Theo blinked. Kilbey was looking directly at her. Here I am? Not you, Kilbey tutted. His right arm plunged right as if plunging into a rock pool. The air mottled and shivered about it. Kilbey leaned hard left, teeth gritted, and as his arm came back towards him, a shorter man in a fur coat appeared on the end of it. The man, possibly Pakistani, Theo thought, had immaculate sideburns that jabbed at neat angles towards a downturned mouth. A frustrated hand flattened well-cut trousers tucked into crocodile boots, scars like waning moons over each knuckle. The other hand was held at a right angle, and Theo saw it clasped a dirty rope that ran into nowhere. 3 knots down it shimmered, blurred, and then simply wasn't there. Well, don't just bloody sit there drinking, the new arrival grizzled. Actually, I was waiting, Kilbey retorted, and we've had a shock. Well, I ain't gonna come through alone. The man, Nero, hadn't looked at Theo, but when he did, it was as if he still hadn't. Perhaps there was a flicker of recognition, but it was subsumed by a simmering irritation. Kilbey stood, and soon both he and Nero had hold of the rope with both hands, their soles sliding across the dust-slick floorboards with only slightly less velocity than each step that drove them in the opposite direction. Well, don't get up, will you, Cartwright? Kilbey winced. Actually, I wasn't going to. Theo lifted her glass as an empty toast to their efforts. The cadence with which she had replied, so closely matching that with which Kilbey had earlier retorted, unnerved her. There was something unusually infectious about Kilbey's manner, his banter. Or was she merely more susceptible than she liked to think herself? 3 minutes of straining, and a dark shape began to scorch the air before the bar. Theo shifted in her seat, worried about floaters. Her whiskey glass struck a somber note on the tabletop. The air buckled and bulged as if nauseated, and finally spat a large black object onto the floorboards, with enough force to knock both Kilbey and Nero to their backsides. It was a black cab, slightly old-fashioned and thoroughly battered, bent hubcaps unevenly spinning on only 2 of its 4 wheels. It continued a slow path across the floor, only halted by Kilbey slapping both hands on the fender and Nero hurrying around to crunch the handbrake. As soon as it was parked, Nero walked a circuit, checking for new bumps and scratches in an already extensive catalogue. "We'll need this," Kilbey explained, returning to neck back the last of his whiskey. "If we're going to get home again." "It's a black cab," Theo said. Even at the time, she was sure she should have had more to say on this. "How's that going to get us home?" "Well, it's my black cab, innit?" Nero said, still not looking at her. "Stupid bloody idea bringing it through." "Ignore him," Kilbey said, an eyebrow darting nowhere surprising. "The cab will take us back in time, to the moment you slip through, as soon as we find it." "Back in time?" Now the smirk was out, and there was nothing Theo could do about it. Nero folded his arms, leaning against the cab and picking sawdust and lint from the sleeve of his coat. "She really don't remember anything." "She's been bent out of shape," Kilbey said, back over his shoulder. With half a smile at Theo, he produced a small battered book from inside his coat. Its covers were worn and bent, in places the title obscured by furred scars that ran across it, in ridges and craters. 100 post-it notes jutted from pages that no longer sat true. Nonetheless, Theo recognized it easily enough. She had a copy of her own in her satchel. A London A to Z. "This lets us find our way around," Kilbey said. "It's got a lot of shortcuts, the ones all the best cabbies know about. Ones that get you to your destination before you've even left." "Of course." Theo's eyes were even wider than they might have been, had she believed a word he was saying, and she kept an exaggerated smile perfectly across both cheeks. "It's a time-travelling book that lets you time-travel in your black cab." "You're a time-travelling detective." "Right." Kilbey was briefly pleased. "It's a small book, only good for the city limits, and no good for more than a fortnight each way. Gets us from A to Z, though. And..." His relief slipped some heavy distance from his cheeks. "You're not buying any of this, are you?" "Not at all." "We did just make a black cab appear on the first floor of an abandoned pub. I think that buys us some credit." "Not enough." "Okay." Kilbey nodded, resigned. He threw the book backwards over his shoulder to Nero, who had to dart forward to catch it, and took out a pouch of tobacco from his coat. "Go on then, Nero," he said casually, rolling himself a cigarette. "You sure?" You know what she's like. With a grunt, Nero strode across to the table, turned it over, and grabbed Theo by the leather lapels of her jacket. As she swore and kicked, bottle and glass smashing in a mess by her trainers, he turned his head so that he was looking somewhere more interesting, and dragged her across to the vehicle. He was surprisingly strong, all sinew and tendon under the fur. Kilbey was already holding the rear door open with the hand that wasn't holding a lighter to his cigarette. Theo was deposited bulkily and gracelessly across the leather seat, Kilbey quickly slipping in behind her and slapping her on the arse until she sat up to give him room. "What the fuck?" Her hair was everywhere and she glared out through it. "He's better at the manual labour," Kilbey explained, jetting blue smoke to the ceiling from his bottom lip. "And the driving. It's why I keep him around." Nero was already behind the wheel in the front, pumping the accelerator as the engine roared. Twisting the wheel full left, he sent the cab heading towards one of the large windows through which the low buildings of Camden, pubs and clubs and markets, could be seen hazy and grey. All of this was now rushing toward Theo with worrying speed. "Okay, very funny, you can stop now," she said, working hard at calm. Cool, aloof, anything but credulous and fearful. The cab picked up speed, and suddenly there wasn't time to brake before brick and shattered glass and metal bunched like a thoughtlessly shoved sleeve. Nero wasn't even looking, concentrating instead on his small book of maps. The wall ran at them and then through them. Nothing broke or shattered or bunched. Theo's stomach lurched and everything was drunken lights, tracing paths down countless roads, intersecting, slicing, curving, knots and tangles of pure energy. It reminded her of satellite photographs of London, where the city was mapped in fizzling orange electricity. And then, they were somewhere else. "So they're insane," Anna suggested. "It's a slow descent into madness kind of thing. Your character's life is so dull she fantasizes herself somewhere else, is that it? I'm sure there's a market for it. Anna, I know what it sounds like, but it isn't madness, I promise. Uh-huh. There was a tightness to Anna's top lip that wasn't going anywhere. The first trip took Theo back 24 hours. She saw herself smoking outside the shop, dropping her plastic lighter, mistaking the person in the corner of her eye for someone on the street. The three of them watched from the cab, parked across the road, pulling away from the curb as the lighter dropped. I remember this, Theo said quietly. Maybe she was amazed, but she wasn't sure she wanted anyone to know. I saw the cab. All looks normal, Kilbey decided, rapping on the window dividing the driver from the rear compartment. I told you! Don't do that! Nero growled in the rear view. I ain't your bloody chauffeur, am I? Kilbey gave Theo a little smile that disagreed. Then they were back a week. Theo staggered out of a minicab late Friday night, tripped drunkenly on the steps to a front door, stockings peeled back from a grazed knee, but she found it briefly amusing, swayed as she matched the key to her door. Again, copper-bottom Cartwright, Kilbey noted, with something in his cheeks that suggested more familiarity than Theo felt appropriate. Another 48 hours back, a plastic bag split and cast tins and frozen peas to the pavement. A teenager rode straight through her discarded groceries, leaving a canyon of green mush and yellow plastic. Another 34 hours back. The map only took anyone where there was already a shortcut, Kilbey explained. TV light splashed about the first floor window. A kettle boiled, whistling too long until the end of a scene. Another 20 hours or so. Nothing. Absolutely nothing. The lights faded and there was no city. No streets, no passing cars or buses, no distant rattle and spark of the overground. Silence and a matte blackness. Not even blackness, but an absence of colour. The engine stuttered and died. Nero cursed and held the book up to the glass. He allowed his thumb to flick through the pages he'd just driven across, from the middle toward the back. Maps that might have been street maps, but for their complexity and, Theo couldn't be sure of this, a slow shifting and contorting, soft as clouds on a still afternoon. Then his thumb skipped into the last quarter, and there were no maps. Page after page was blank. Dog-eared, but brand new. Kilbey sat forward in his seat. There's nothing beyond a week and a half ago. I suppose that fits. Fits? Theo reached for a cigarette of her own. It was the most normal thing she could think of. Why is there nothing? Well, this dimension, this particular reality, didn't exist before a week and a half ago. Right now, through that windscreen, it's just waiting for existence. He leaned across to light Theo's cigarette, and kept looking at her. Waiting for you. For me? Why? What's so special about me? Well, for one thing, you do have an incredibly attractive boyfriend. That's a real asset, trust me. But I don't think that's it. I think something must have chosen you. Something you did. Did when? A week and a half ago I didn't even exist. Theo shook her head. This doesn't make sense. I remember getting the job in the bookshop a year ago. I remember getting off the plane. I spent 3 weeks in this overpriced hostel in Earl's Court where a full breakfast was half a slice of toast. Well, some of those memories are real. Some aren't. Whatever built this reality changed you to fit in. Tell me about your first day on the job. What happened? Theo was ready to tell him, and, in doing so, realized she couldn't. She remembered every day working in that shop because every day was the same, stretching back forever, arriving late, opening up, reading Henry Miller. Christ, she couldn't remember reading any other book in the entire time she'd worked there. She couldn't even remember starting Henry. Similarly, she knew she had arrived in London at some point 18 months ago, and knew she had stayed in a hostel in Earl's Court where a full breakfast was half a slice of toast. When she tried to remember more, That same sentence skipped ahead to the tip of her tongue, and nothing followed it. It was like a refrain from a half-forgotten song, constantly circling and feeding back into itself, refusing to divulge the next lyrics. "It had taken me weeks to find a job," she said, her voice trickling away from her without effort. "I'd spent 3 weeks in a hostel in Earl's Court, where... oh God." Both hands went to her mouth. There was no cynicism left, only heat in her cheeks. "This is insane." She looked out through the window at the nothingness there, and wondered if she saw something move. There were, she thought, the suggestions of shapes, of bodies, of figures, in the same way there had been creatures in the darkness when she had lain awake in bed as a child. Imagination pulling horrors from night blindness. Now, the harder she stared, the less certain she was that other horrors were almost there in the black, waiting for a careless foot over the edge of the mattress, waiting, as Kilbey had suggested, for her. "You need to think, Cartwright. Try to remember something you might have done that might have made you vulnerable. Something that might have let something find a way in." Theo turned away from finding faces through the window. Her voice felt light, sitting too high in her chest. "I don't know. Of course I don't know. According to you, I'm not even the person I think I am." Kilbey put a hand on her shoulder. It was a surprisingly thoughtful gesture. "You're the same person. They just fiddled about with the details. Nothing can make you into someone else. They wouldn't have wanted to, since they'd gone to all the trouble of getting you." "I don't know. I don't remember what I was like. I forgot you, apparently. To be honest, I can see that working to my advantage." A quick smile fell away into something more considered. "Does the night of May the 10th mean anything to you?" Theo shook her head. Kilbey smiled again, more enthusiastically. Smiling herself, finding the measure of the man, Theo wiped at her eyes, whether she needed to or not. In doing so, she glanced at her watch, and saw it was, somewhere at least, almost 8 o'clock. "Oh shit, I'm late. I mean, I should be late. Can you be late in a time-travelling cab?" "Oh yeah, all the time," Kilbey said, his smile slanted. "Why are you late?" "I'm supposed to be meeting Anna." The expression on Kilbey's face didn't change, for such a long time that Theo began to feel somewhat conspicuous. Finally, he leaned forward and rapped on the glass, ignoring Nero's complaints. "Take us back," he said. "Why?" Theo asked. "I thought you needed to find out what happened to me." "Okay, sure. Now remember, I know you, Cartwright. Better than you might like to think. I've eaten your cornflakes, I've borrowed your socks, I've met all your friends and offended most of them. Last May I invited 10 people back to your place at 3 a.m. and then went to sleep in your bathtub while they waited in the kitchen. So, tell me one thing." "What?" "Who the hell is Anna?" Anna put her glass down so sharply that Merlot washed onto the back of her pale hand. "Now, I'm in your story. I'm flattered, darling, but really." She laughed lightly, but Theo wasn't smiling. A silence arrived and quickly outstayed its welcome. "Anna, it's you," she said. "What's me?" "I always wondered how we became friends. I mean, I didn't really. That was just the story, I guess. It was what I was supposed to remember. It stopped me thinking too much about it." Anna frowned at Theo for some long seconds, then picked up her glass again, making the effort at diffidence. "To be honest, that all started quite interestingly, darling, but I think it went a bit off the rails after all that stuff about the terrible creature who ate the cats. Maybe you've been spending too long alone in that shop of yours." Theo still wasn't smiling. "Anna, how did we become friends?" The glass went back down. "My God, you're serious, aren't you?" "Tell me, please." Theo reached across and took both of Anna's hands in her own. Her eyes were wide and her forehead flat. "You see, I want us to be friends. I actually want this to be real. I really do. So tell me how we became friends. Well, we just met at some party or other. You were new in London, and I... Anna faltered. A long finger traced her bottom lip, as if checking the story's foundations. Theo sat back in her chair, let her hands fall to her lap. We never met, she said. You see, we worked out what happened on the night you came and took me. Theo had been out with a friend from work, tagging along to a birthday dinner. The venue was a Vietnamese place in Hackney. There was little more than a hollowed-out hall with 24 trestle tables. The food had been excellent, though, and several trips had been made to a Turkish corner shop that stocked a cheap but sinkable Bulgarian red. The night was full of warm, enthusiastic drunkenness, and although Theo had barely known anyone, she had felt enveloped in their friendships, felt plugged into a network spreading across the city, felt people were interested. They listened to her stories and remarked on differences. They held smiles open for her. Then, towards the end of the evening, something happened. People became tired or comfortable and began to remember other dinners, other friends. Half anecdotes opened enough to display gaps the listener was expected to fill. And although people still smiled and nodded when Theo talked, she was aware of the politeness on their part. When talk turned to future dinners, someone would gesture across the table and insist that she should join them, from the tight sort of grin that hoped it was understood to mean nothing. Theo went home alone, knowing she would see none of them again. She felt somewhat vulgar, as if her friendliness, her assumption that these people with London lives and families and histories might welcome her, revealed something naive and colonial. She felt a visitor from somewhere uncivilized, whose diverting difference would quickly tire. She had realized, her head bumping in a regular rhythm on the bus window, that she hadn't made a female friend since coming to London. First there had been the ex to occupy her, then Kilbey. She had poured herself into romances at a cost that was now brutally naked before her. There had been flirtations and acquaintances, but nothing substantial. No one who knew her well enough to account for her poor accounting and always expect her 15 minutes late. No one plugged into the London she had glimpsed from afar through television screens. No one to regularly chide but quietly adore her. There was a friend-shaped hole in Theo's life, perfectly defined, waiting to be filled. That night, as she had slipped into melancholically drunken sleep, something glimpsed in the corner of her eye found its way into that hole and took her somewhere else. Kilbey put down his pool cue, leaving Nero to set up the next game, and pulled up a chair. He quickly introduced himself, and Anna shook his hand, limply. She was blinking too much, sitting at an angle in her chair. You were waiting in the darkness, Kilbey told her. In a sideways place. Not quite there. Theo glimpsed you that night, saw exactly the sort of person she needed. So while she was seeing you, you reached in and pulled her here. Created enough of a life to keep her thinking she belonged here, thinking you were real. She was the foundation. As long as she kept seeing you, kept thinking you were real, you were. There was a yelp from the direction of the pool table. A floater had appeared in the centre of the felt, scattering the balls Nero had gathered and sending them back into pockets. Theo isn't the weak point, Kilbey told her. He spoke calmly, never once looking away from Anna. It's you. You left a Theo-shaped hole in two realities, this one and my one. A fracture in the glass. Until it's repaired, those beasties will be popping up all over the place. Nero spun the cue in his hand and went to thump the scavenger hard with the thick end, but the creature was already at the bar, poised before an attractive young man with good teeth. Revealing a far worse set, the creature's jaw dropped and top lip peeled back until it was nothing but mouth. A mouth that swooped forward, engulfing both the young man and the stool he sat on. The thin, greasy, dark skin stretched, bones cracking and rearranging as its squat body distended, until it resembled some tropical python digesting its prey. Then slowly, it constricted, crunched, clenched, and tightened back until it was nothing more than a wizened head. "People are dying, Anna," Kilbey said. It was as earnest as Theo had seen him. "Real people." "But I'm real," Anna said. The protest appeared to burst free from her, as if she had been determined to say nothing. "I feel real. I exist. I know things. I have a job. And a life. How can I have these things, know things, if I'm not real?" "They're just things you've glimpsed," Kilbey said. "Out of the corner of your eye. They're not real." He sat forward, pulling his chair in so that Nero could push past. Anna looked to Theo, went to grab her hands, but Theo didn't have them on offer. "But I know you, darling. I'm your best friend, aren't I?" There was a rush, a swish, and a smash by the bar as Nero sent the diminishing creature through the pub's front window with the butt of his cue. The creature scrabbled about on the damp pavement, then faded into the rain. "Time to go," Nero said, shoving the cue in his armpit. Theo sat, her hands on her lap, looking at her best friend. She wanted to tear this scene up, to forget complications, to continue. She held herself back, pretended she could. "I believed we were friends," she said. "I still do. But it's not real." She looked at her boots, frowning. When she spoke again, it was with a certainty more determined than it was felt. "I need things to be real," she said. Anna lurched across the table, grabbed Theo by the elbow. For once she spoke without poise, eyes glaring and wide. "There's nothing waiting for me there, behind the glass. All we do there is watch, wait for you to notice us, to let us in. We need you. I need you. Without you, I'm nothing." Theo couldn't look at her. "I'm sorry," she said. Anna's hand stayed at her elbow. "You were better with me. I helped you." "I know. Don't set me back." "I'm sorry." They took Anna back to the darkness, as close as they could get to the edge of the maps where nothingness stopped, and for a week and a half became something else. In the end, she kissed both of Theo's cheeks and didn't quite say goodbye. She slid off the leather seat, through the open door, and was gone before her heels touched down. She became a shape that could almost be drawn out of the darkness. Nero held up the book, thumbed through maps that weren't there anymore. "Is everything fixed now?" Theo asked, no longer looking at the window. "The hole, I mean." Kilbey ground out a cigarette into an ashtray and shook his head. "That was just one hole. We've plastered that crack, but there'll be plenty more. History's falling apart. God knows what else will try coming through." They sat in silence, but for the stutter and hum of the engine, waiting to be pushed sideways, for the fracture to be unfractured, once they were again the right side of the glass. And then Theo woke with a dry hangover, and the nagging sensation that she had embarrassed herself, although she couldn't be sure why. For most of an hour she kicked about in coarse sheets on an uncomfortable mattress, flinching at things revealed sour by the light through her curtains. Kilbey came by around midday, with nothing particular to say. There was a job he had finished that he felt was of little interest to anyone. He made 3 pots of tea, which he mainly drank, then sat on her sofa and talked through the afternoon movie. Redubbed scenes with wit or obscenity. He seemed as easy with both. When he stood to make the 4th pot, his A to Z tumbled out of his coat to the floor. Theo picked it up, quickly flicking through from cover to cover, exposing a gallery of post-it notes across 200 maps. Streets that shifted and bent against each other. Kilbey waited for her to hand the book back before heading for the kettle. He never liked to let the book out of his sight for long, but she always enjoyed teasing impatience out of him. By the evening, she had reconciled herself to the events of the previous night. She no longer felt embarrassed, and now found herself looking with disdain on the polite faces in their closed circles. It was their loss. But something elusive still troubled her, had her shifting in her seat when her mind wandered from the television, even as Kilbey's hand crept from her far shoulder down the front of her shirt to cradle her left breast. Something was missing that outstripped the standard post-boozy sense of panic and loss. Finally, when the light was out and the room was lost to darkness, Theo lay awake for some time, making shapes out of the shadows, and trying hard to imagine what this missing thing might be.